President Yoon is bound for Tokyo on Thursday for a sit-down with the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, signaling warming bilateral ties through top-level diplomacy. What to expect from the summit? Our on-point test analysis. Inflation in the U.S. in February continued its slow but gradual cooling trend, but the 6% rise will likely push the Fed to raise benchmark interest rates despite the recent banking industry crash. Russian fighter jets collide with a U.S. drone, causing it to crash into the Black Sea. The intense encounter heightening tensions between the two countries, with relations increasingly strained since the Ukraine crisis. President Yoon is bound for Tokyo on Thursday for a sit-down with the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. And it seems both Seoul and Tokyo see it as a chance to get the bumpy bilateral ties back on track through top-level diplomacy. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young starts us off this morning.
South Korea and Japan are set to normalize their bilateral relations with a breakthrough summit in Tokyo. Ahead of President Yoon Suk-yeol's working visit to Japan, National Security Advisor Kim Sung-han said the South Korean leader and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will discuss all areas of bilateral ties to break the vicious cycle of spiraling relations between the neighbours, which fell to a critical low 4 years ago. At the core of their talks will be resolving the trade dispute triggered in 2019, when Japan slapped controls on exports of key chip materials to Seoul. This followed a Korean court ruling that ordered Japanese firms to compensate the Koreans they subjected to forced labour before and during World War II. After Seoul announced this month a plan to compensate the Korean victims of forced labour through private funding without demanding reparations from Japanese firms, Yoon and Kishida will discuss follow-up measures to move forward. Stabilising military intel sharing will also be discussed, as the practice became rocky under the previous Moon and Abe administrations.
There will be an opportunity to discuss ways to resolve policy barriers and deepen economic cooperation between the two countries. Through this summit and a dinner event, the two leaders can affirm their will to enhance bilateral relations as they build mutual trust on a personal level.
Yoon's schedule will begin with a lunch with Korean nationals, followed by a summit and state dinner with Kishida. Tokyo-based media says Kishida is likely to make a rare move of hospitality, treating Yoon to a two-pot dinner of Japanese beef stew and an omelette-topped rice dish known to be enjoyed by the South Korean leader. On Friday morning, Yoon will greet bilateral friendship groups and sit down for a roundtable and lunch with business leaders from both countries. Signifying the focus on future-oriented ties, the president will give a lecture to Korean and Japanese students at Keio University. As Yoon moves to restore top-level exchanges between the two countries since 2011, Kodo News says Kishida is considering inviting Yoon to the G7 summit in May and making a reciprocal visit to Seoul afterwards. All eyes are now on whether the Yoon-Kishida meeting will result in a joint statement that turns their determination to improve bilateral ties into practical action. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Now, experts say that while some bilateral issues are important, the softening the relations between the two countries will have a greater effect internationally. Our Kim Do-yeon breaks down Yoon's issues at hand.
President Yoon Suk-yeol's diplomatic capabilities will be put to test as he heads to Japan for the first summit in Tokyo for a Korean president in 12 years. So what are some gains that President Yoon can make during this important trip?
The two leaders will discuss ways to normalize bilateral ties on all fronts, including what comes after our announcement of a solution for compensating Korean victims of Japan's forced labor, and they will exchange their opinions on various issues.
The announcement for the visit to Japan came just 3 days after South Korea proposed a solution to the core issue at hand for the cold relations, compensating Korean victims of Japan's forced wartime labor. That said, this may open ways to address immediate issues. This includes Japan returning to South Korea to the white list of preferred trading partners, Experts also say efforts to improve bilateral ties by Seoul and Tokyo are in the interest of the U.S. as well.
The direct results of the compensation plans seems to focus on the cooperation of South Korea, the US and Japan in security. The US has shown a strong drive for trilateral cooperation, so the summit will include different topics, but at the core, it will be trilateral cooperation.
And also on the agenda could be Seoul asking for Japan's support for joining the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, also known as the Quad, a strategic group comprised of the US, Japan, India, and Australia.
Of course, we would aim for being part of working groups of the Quad. Becoming a full member wouldn't be easy. But within the group, there are 3 working groups such as for semiconductors and rare earths, as well as pandemic response.
South Korean officials have said Seoul could play a role in the Quad's working groups spanning areas from maritime security and supply chains to semiconductor technology. As the question of economic security becomes all the more important, Seoul and Tokyo have shown eagerness to forge greater cooperation. The president's security advisor also said changes in the two governments' stance toward each other could lead to more civilian exchanges with greater business and tourism between the two countries. That, he said, comes from trust, one of the most important assets in diplomacy. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
North Korea continues to display its unhappiness with the ongoing joint military drills between Seoul and Washington. On top of launching 2 short-range ballistic missiles on Tuesday morning, the regime also fired 2 medium-range ground-to-ground ballistic missiles the same day. Our Lee Sin-jae has more.
Following Tuesday morning's report that North Korea fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the East Sea, North Korea's state media said Wednesday it had fired 2 medium-range ground-to-ground ballistic missiles. The Korean Central News Agency also released photos showing the KN-23, the North Korean version of the Russian Iskander, being launched from a transporter erector launcher. KCNA added that the missiles were launched from Changyeon County in South Hwanghae Province, with the missiles hitting their target some 611 kilometers away. The latest provocation is widely considered to be in response to the Freedom Shield military exercise currently taking place between South Korea and the United States. Meanwhile, a U.S. Department of Defense spokesperson said Tuesday that any use of nuclear weapons by Pyongyang will mean the end of the regime. Speaking at a daily press briefing, Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Pat Ryder issued Washington's latest warning against any use of such weapons after North Korea last year enacted a new law that would allow preemptive use of its nuclear weapons when deemed necessary. Ryder also stressed that the U.S. remains committed to deterring North Korea's continued aggression, adding that the U.S. and its allies in the Indo-Pacific region will continue to cooperate closely to preserve security and stability in the region. Lee Sin-jae, Arirang News.
Inflation in the U.S. in February continued its slow but gradual cooling trend. But economists say this won't be enough for the Fed to put rate hikes on hold. Our Shin Se-byuk with this report.
U.S. consumer prices once again eased last month. In February, the consumer price index dropped to 6% from 6.4% in January. It is encouraging given that it is the 8th consecutive month showing a year-on-year slowdown, and also a significant drop from the peak of over 9% seen in June last year. The fluttering headline rate is mostly due to a fall in energy prices and deflation in the used car market, followed by a post-pandemic recovery in the supply chain. Core CPI, without volatile food and energy prices, continued to rise at an uncomfortably fast pace in February. It increased by 0.5% last month, an acceleration from the 0.4% jump recorded a month earlier. The rising cost of shelter, which accounts for over 70% of the total rise in prices, was a significant contributor. In February, it rose by another 0.8%. Meanwhile, even with signs of headline inflation easing, the Federal Reserve is widely expected to go ahead with another rate hike next week, potentially another 25 basis point hike. This is because inflation remains at 3 times the Fed's target of 2%, and despite the recent failure of regional banks in the U.S.
The real question for everyone is thinking about the Fed's direction all the way through May and June as it relates to, do we have a series of 25? But I think everybody's decided it's pretty much 25 this time due to the bank scare.
Despite the 6% inflation figure, U.S. stocks ended higher on Tuesday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed up 1.1%, the S&P 500 up 1.7%, and the Nasdaq Composite over 2% up. 신새벽 Arirang News.
The unprecedented meetup between the two leaders of South Korea and Japan is a major follow-up to plans to compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through donations by Korean firms. Now, what to expect from the summit? For more, we're joined by Professor Kim Jae-chun from Seogang Graduate School of International Studies. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Good morning. A joint statement on a new partnership between South Korea and Japan is likely to be issued when President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida meet. What do you think will be included?
Well, the most basic things, fundamental things. I think two leaders will declare that Korea and Japan are two very important partner countries to protect and promote what is known as rules-based liberal international order, which revisionist countries are trying to revise to their liking. So two leaders will declare that two countries share core identities as liberal democracy, capitalist market economy, and it's just very natural for two most important democracies in Asia to cooperate in this new Cold War era. And in order for that to happen, two countries will have to move forward from unfortunate history issues. Two countries will have to pursue future-oriented relationship. So that way they can cooperate on security issues as well as economic issues, particularly in the Pacific region. So I think the joint statement will declare the most fundamental and basic reason why two countries will have to come together and move forward to a future-oriented relationship.
Right, lots of basic fundamental issues to be discussed since we're starting from ground zero. Now, President Yoon has ordered ministries to come up with cooperative projects specifically focusing on future-oriented Seoul-Tokyo relations. Will these projects, do you think, will help restore bilateral ties? I mean, what steps or projects will Japan need to take on?
Well, for one example, South Korea suggested that two countries will launch what is known as Future Youth Fund, which is to sponsor scholarship for students in both countries and to expedite academic and also cultural exchanges between future generations in both countries. So this is one example of future-oriented projects, I think. And Japan did agree to creation of such fund. Japan's Business Federation, which is known as KDRN, pledged to make contribution to the fund. So did the Korean Jeongyeonmyeon, the Korean Federation of Industries, and also AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, pledged that they would participate in donations. So if things go well as planned, this project could work as a symbol for the future-oriented relations between the two countries. But I think one condition should be met, though, and that condition is that Japan really needs to reciprocate South Korea's goodwill gesture that President Yoon Suk-yeol made a couple of weeks ago.
Right. Professor Kim, like you said, maybe it is time to move on, but hopes are low that there'll be a sincere apology from the Japanese side regarding the compensating Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor during Yoon's Tokyo visit. Will this remain the elephant in the room? I mean, from going forward, even after compensating the victims? I mean, what needs to be done in order to completely done with the forced labor feud?
Well, I think the compensation solution is still a work in progress. I mean that solution to compensate victims of wartime forced labor is really a work in progress. The Yoon Suk-yeol government did to take great pains to induce Japanese government to apologize, took great pains to induce Japanese companies to pay, these Japanese companies, Nippon Steel Industry, Mitsubishi Industry. They should have contributed to the compensation, but Japan was really persistent. They kept saying that that's not going to happen. So the President Yoon really made a very bold move here. Okay, if you don't pay, you don't pay. If you don't apologize, you don't apologize. We'll pay. So let's just move forward. But now the glass is really half full, as South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin said during the news conference. Now, as I said, it's really important for Japan to reciprocate. Japan really have to put in good faith efforts here. For one thing, Japanese government officials will have to be very careful, careful about what they say. I mean, if some Japanese government officials say that there wasn't really forced labor, that labor was purely on a voluntary basis. And if some officials say, those kinds of things, make those remarks, and I think that could ruin the whole thing. So Japan really have to reciprocate and then put in good faith efforts here.
Right. Before we let you go, Professor, Yoon and Kishida are having 2 rounds of dinners, right? Why 2 rounds, and what can we expect to be discussed at the second dinner table, especially?
It's quite unusual for 2 leaders to have sort of back-to-back dinner.
Right.
Why 2 rounds of dinner? I read that there is this very famous Japanese traditional restaurant that specializes in tonkatsu, Japanese-style pork cutlets, and omurice, Japanese-style omelette rice. And it is known that President Yoon likes tonkatsu and omurice very much. So that's the reason why Japanese government picked this famous Japanese restaurant as a place for the second dinner. What do I expect them to discuss at the second dinner table? Come on, you don't expect them to discuss how to compensate, first victims, or you don't expect them to discuss any serious issues over dinner. I think it's time to socialize, to befriend. So I expect them to have good time, good dinners, actually, with nice Japanese sake. So in this case, ambiance is more important than the substance.
I see. So a rather casual in an atmosphere to just, I guess, mingle and just get to know each other as persons and also as leaders, right?
Exactly.
Right. All right. Thank you, Professor. Always appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
The mask mandate for public transportation and pharmacies located at supermarkets is set to be lifted here in the country. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters will announce the details in the coming hour, with a high possibility that the change in rules will go into effect next Monday. It's been 2 years and 5 months since wearing a mask was made mandatory on public transportation. But mask wearing will remain in place at hospitals and nursing homes for the time being. Countries like Greece, Malaysia, and Taiwan will still require mask wearing on public transportation. From today, China has resumed issuing all types of visas for foreigners, paving the way for the country's complete reopening of its borders. Earlier this week, multiple Chinese embassies announced the country was resuming the functions of previously issued multi-year visas, while also bringing back the issuance of tourism, medical, and port visas. Visa exemptions for Hainan, Shanghai, and for visiting Guangdong from Hong Kong and Macau have also returned. But China still does not allow its people to go on group tours to certain countries, including South Korea, the U.S., and Japan. PCR tests are also required for foreigners within 48 hours before boarding China-bound flights. For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley joining us here in the studio. Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning, Tommy.
Let's start in the Black Sea, where a U.S. drone was reportedly forced down into the water after an encounter with the two Russian fighter jets.
Well, that's right. According to the U.S. military, the American MQ-9 Reaper drone ended up in the water on Tuesday local time after its propeller was reportedly damaged by one of two Russian Su-27s. Now, the downing occurred over international waters when the drone was met by the two Russian aircraft while carrying out routine operations. U.S. reports say that over the course of 30 to 40 minutes, one of the jets dumped fuel on the drone multiple times and flew in front of it and eventually made physical contact with its propeller. But Russia has said that the drone was traveling with its transponders turned off, which meant the aircraft could not be tracked. The Kremlin also denied that the two aircraft made contact, saying that the drone crashed after a supposed sharp maneuver. Now, turning to the tech sector, where Meta is set to lay off 10,000 of its employees and will leave 5,000 of its empty positions unfilled. According to CEO Mark Zuckerberg on Tuesday, the job cuts will take place over the next several months. He added that it comes amid higher U.S. interest rates, instability in the global geopolitics, and increased regulations. Now, the layoff is the second major round of job cuts by Facebook's parent company in just 4 months. It means that Meta's staff count will soon be 66,000, marking a 25% workforce reduction since the first layoffs were announced. The layoffs come amid a series of job cuts across the tech industry. According to a tech layoff tracker, the tech sector has seen 128,000 job cuts this year alone. Now, football fans eagerly anticipating the 2026 World Cup will have more to look forward to, as the next event will feature a record 104 matches. World football's governing body, FIFA, announced the changes to the format on Tuesday. Jointly hosted by the United States, Mexico and Canada, the 2026 edition will see 48 teams divided into 12 groups of 4 teams. The first knockout round will feature 32 teams composed of the top 2 teams from each group and the 8 best third-placed teams. Since 1998, the tournament had hosted 32 teams and 64 games, with only the top 2 teams from 8 groups advancing to the knockout stage. And finally, Libyans across the country gathered in the city of Sabratha last Friday to celebrate National Couscous Day with a giant version of the country's staple food. Measuring at 4 meters in diameter, the dish weighed some 2,500 kilograms and contained the meat of 5 camels. The making of the dish marked the 3rd time Libya has held the day. Made from semolina or corn wheat, couscous is consumed across the countries in North Africa and is usually combined with meat and vegetables.
Good morning. We couldn't ask for better weather yesterday. We had very pleasant early spring weather under bright skies with fine air quality. The capital region will have a slight drop in highs compared to yesterday, but still above norms with cloudier skies in the second half of the day. Wet clouds will pass through the country's upper regions, dropping spotty rain in northern parts of Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do, while central regions will see less rainfall, which will not be enough to ease the dryness in the air. Seoul, south of Gyeonggi-do and parts of the south remain under a dry weather advisory. A strong wind also boosting the risk of wildfire. In fact, mountainous regions in Gangwon-do province are under a strong wind advisory as well. Meanwhile, those in southern provinces will have highs that are 2 to 4 degrees higher, topping out at 22 degrees in Daegu and Gyeongju this afternoon, Gwangju at 21 degrees. Now, our morning temperatures will drop near the freezing mark in the next few days, so please be mindful of more temperature swings and dress accordingly. That's Korea for you. Here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's A New Day at Arirang. Do stay with us for more updates throughout the day. Thanks for watching.